In the early days of January 1968, Khe Sanh did not appear on most strategic maps as a place of destiny. It was one of dozens of isolated American bases scattered through the northern highlands of South Vietnam, a collection of bunkers, trenches, and aluminum huts built atop red earth that turned to sludge in the rain. Yet beneath its quiet surface, tension was building. Reconnaissance patrols reported new trails carved into the jungle. Captured documents hinted at a massing of North Vietnamese forces in the mountains to the west. Officers in the 3rd Marine Division knew something was coming, but they underestimated the scale. The Marines stationed on the outer hills lived under constant tension. Their outposts were skeletal low bunkers reinforced with sandbags, logs, and steel plates from crashed aircraft. Supplies arrived infrequently, and most nights the men listened to the rhythmic thud of artillery echoing in the distance. For African-American Marines like Sergeant Johnny Barnett, a squad leader from Chicago's South Side, and Private David Green, a 19-year-old rifleman from rural Mississippi, Khe Sanh was both a battlefield and a contradiction. They fought for a country that did not see them as equals, and they did it within an institution where prejudice still ran deep. On paper, Lima and Gulf companies of the 3rd Battalion 26th Marines were fully integrated. In practice, the system relegated many black Marines to labor or support roles. But on the remote perimeter hills, manpower was scarce, and every Marine carried a rifle. The men formed tight groups built on survival rather than race. They shared the same rations, endured the same cold monsoon winds, and dug the same trenches through clay that clung to everything it touched. The morning of January 21 began like many others. Mist rising from the valley, helicopters clattering overhead, and the sharp metallic smell of fuel. Then came the first explosion. A rocket slammed into the main base, followed by another and another. Within minutes, the entire plateau shook with fire. The NVA's long-anticipated siege had begun. Within the first hour, ammunition dumps exploded, sending columns of smoke thousands of feet into the air. Over the next days, the artillery fire became unrelenting. More than 1,000 shells fell daily. For the Marines on the outer hills, there was no protection beyond the bunkers they had built themselves. Hill 861, where Barnett's squad was stationed, took the brunt of the shelling. Communications flickered and died as radio antennas were shredded by shrapnel. Patrols sent down the slope never returned. At night, the flashes of explosions illuminated the jungle like lightning. Sleep came only in brief, shallow bursts between bombardments. By the end of the first week, the isolation was complete. Helicopters attempting to reach the hilltops came under heavy anti-aircraft fire. The few that succeeded in landing stayed for seconds, just long enough to throw out boxes of rations or grab a wounded Marine before lifting away under fire. Barnett's platoon rationed everything: water, ammunition, even cigarettes. The mud caked on their weapons and rain soaked through their flak jackets. Still, they held their posts. Private Green later recalled in an oral history that they began to name the incoming shells by their sound. The deep-throated boom of a 122-millimeter artillery piece meant they had seconds to take cover. The shriek of a rocket meant there was no time at all. "We started counting the distance by sound," he said. "You'd hear the first one land, and you'd know where the next was going." The strain of the siege was physical, but it was also psychological. Every man on the perimeter lived with the knowledge that reinforcements might never come. Some joked to keep sane, others went silent. Letters from home arrived weeks late, soaked and crumpled. The only connection to the outside world came through the crackling radio, where they occasionally heard news reports describing the defense of Khe Sanh as strong. For those huddled on the hills, that word felt hollow. Despite everything, discipline held. Barnett enforced it quietly, without theatrics. He made sure each man kept his weapon clean, each position manned, each bunker reinforced. Green and two others were assigned to night watch, taking shifts in the rain. They often spoke in whispers about what would happen if the enemy finally overran the hill. None of them pretended to know the answer. As the weeks began to blur together, a strange rhythm took hold. The men measured time not by calendars, but by airdrops. If the helicopters came, it was a good day. If they didn't, it was another day to survive on whatever remained. Each resupply drop meant running into the open under fire to collect scattered crates. Marines sprinted through the smoke, dragging boxes of food, ammunition, and medical kits back behind the wire while enemy snipers took aim from the tree line. On one such run, Green was nearly hit by shrapnel from an exploding shell. When he stumbled back behind cover, his face was streaked with mud and sweat. Barnett handed him a canteen and a quiet nod, the only form of praise that mattered. Moments like that defined life on Hill 861. From the air, the outposts appeared insignificant, small patches of brown earth on a vast green landscape. Yet they were the first line of defense for Khe Sanh. Without them, the NVA could have positioned artillery within range of the main base. The Marines on those hills knew it, even if the rest of the world didn't. They fought not for glory, but because leaving meant death. By the end of January, the siege had settled into a brutal stalemate. The hills remained in American hands, but at a terrible cost. The platoons were exhausted, short on supplies, and nearly forgotten by higher command. They listened to the endless rumble of artillery and wondered how long a man could stay alert before breaking. In official records, their positions were listed as holding steady. In truth, they were holding on by sheer willpower. For Sergeant Johnny Barnett, Private David Green, and dozens of others, the perimeter of Khe Sanh became more than a military line. It was a test of endurance that no one outside their hilltop world could truly understand. They had been sent there to hold ground that barely mattered on a map, but in the mud and fire of January 1968, it became a place where forgotten men wrote their own quiet chapter of survival. Hill 861 was little more than a scar of red earth on the northern edge of Khe Sanh's defenses, a hilltop stripped of trees by months of bombardment, where the wind carried the stench of gunpowder and rotting foliage. From its summit, the Marines could see the jungle valley stretching endlessly north toward Laos. It was the perfect observation point, and that was precisely why it was doomed. The North Vietnamese Army knew whoever held 861 controlled the approach to the base. In late January 1968, fewer than 100 Marines occupied that exposed patch of ground. Among them were 24 African-American riflemen from Lima Company, 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, led in part by Sergeant Johnny Barnett. Every day began before dawn with the same ritual. A brief silence, then the first distant thud of NVA artillery from the valley floor. The incoming shells followed seconds later, ripping into the hilltop with terrifying precision. The explosions sent showers of red clay over the bunkers, filled the air with grit, and left men coughing through dust and cordite. The Marines learned to tell time by the shelling. The first barrage at sunrise, another at noon, and heavier bombardments at dusk. By the second week of the siege, the outpost had taken thousands of rounds. Private David Green served as a runner, a dangerous job that required sprinting through open ground between the platoon's scattered foxholes. When radio contact failed, Green carried handwritten messages through shell fire, bent double as shrapnel whined overhead. "Sometimes I couldn't even hear myself think," he recalled years later. "The sky sounded like it was tearing apart." Each trip could have been his last, but without those messages, the hill's defenses would have fallen into chaos. The bombardment was relentless, but worse than the explosions was the waiting. Between attacks, the Marines huddled in silence, listening for the telltale crack of small arms fire that signaled an infantry assault. They lived on adrenaline and exhaustion. Cigarettes were traded like currency. Coffee was a luxury. The African American Marines often grouped together during rare breaks, swapping stories about home. Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Jackson, places that felt like another planet. Their laughter, brief and dry, sometimes broke the tension, if only for a few minutes. By February 3, the NVA made their move. Scouts spotted movement in the valley just before nightfall, faint shadows slipping through the fog. Then the mortars came. Within minutes, Hill 861 was engulfed in fire. The ground shook as the first wave of NVA infantry surged up the slopes. The Marines opened fire with M16s and M60 machine guns, their tracers slicing through the dark. Barnett's squad, positioned near the western flank, took the brunt of the assault. The attack lasted hours. The air filled with smoke, the screams of the wounded, and the metallic chatter of machine guns overheating. When the M60 barrels began to glow red, the men switched to grenades, lobbing them downhill until their hands blistered. Then came the close fighting, bayonets, rifle butts, fists. The NVA were determined to overrun the position, but the Marines refused to give ground. Every yard of soil was contested in blood. At dawn, the hill was quiet again. The slopes below were littered with bodies. Enemy soldiers tangled in barbed wire or sprawled in shallow craters. The price of holding had been devastating. Nearly a third of the platoon was dead or wounded. The few who could still stand moved silently through the wreckage, checking for survivors, dragging the injured back to the bunkers. Smoke drifted across the valley. The NVA had withdrawn, but they would return. The following morning, the men tried to call for medevac. Their radio operator, Corporal Jenkins, worked furiously to raise the base, tapping through static and broken signals. When the reply came, it was brief. Hold position, evac choppers inbound. Minutes later, 2 helicopters appeared through the low clouds. They circled once before coming under heavy machine gun fire from the jungle. One was hit and spiraled out of control, crashing into the valley below. The second managed to drop supplies but couldn't land. The Marines watched helplessly as it vanished back into the mist. After that, no more helicopters came for days. The wounded were treated with what little morphine remained. Splints were made from rifle stocks, bandages from torn uniforms. The smell of blood and decay mixed with the damp jungle air. Barnett divided the remaining ammunition evenly among the men. Every round counted. If they came again, he told them, we'd fight with rocks if we had to. Morale was a fragile thing. Some men cursed the distant command that seemed to have forgotten them. Others found strength in defiance, in the simple refusal to give up the hill. Letters written during those weeks, later recovered from personal effects, reveal a tone of quiet endurance. "We don't think about home much anymore," one Marine wrote. "The hill is home now." Even amid the chaos, routines continued. At dawn, the sentries scanned the valley through binoculars. Midday was spent reinforcing bunkers, clearing debris, or burying the dead in shallow trenches at the hill's edge. Nights were long and sleepless, lit by the pale glow of flares drifting above the jungle. The sound of insects mixed with distant gunfire. Each day was a repeat of the last, a cycle of waiting, fighting, repairing, and waiting again. By the end of February's first week, the Marines on Hill 861 had achieved something that went unnoticed by the outside world. They had held. Against superior numbers, constant bombardment, and total isolation, fewer than 100 men, nearly half of them African American, had preserved the northern line of Khe Sanh. Yet in official reports, their ordeal was reduced to a single sentence: position remains secure. For the men themselves, there was no sense of victory, only survival. The hill was quiet now, but everyone knew it wouldn't last. The NVA had tested their defenses and learned their range. The next attack would come soon, stronger and deadlier. As Barnett looked over the misty valley that morning, he said nothing. He simply adjusted his helmet, wiped the mud from his rifle, and went back to work. The forgotten line was still holding, for now. By the middle of February 1968, Hill 861 had ceased to resemble a military outpost and had become something closer to a scar carved into the earth. The hill's once green ridgeline was now a mosaic of shell holes, burnt vegetation, and half-collapsed bunkers. The Marines stationed there lived inside the craters they once feared, their world reduced to mud, smoke, and the steady percussion of incoming artillery. Rain fell almost daily, mixing with the blood and dirt until everything turned the same dark red color. The men stopped cleaning their weapons after every barrage because they knew another was coming within the hour. Food arrived irregularly, and only when helicopters managed to break through the monsoon clouds. The supply drops were blind guesses, parachutes floating through the smoke, many landing hundreds of yards down the slope. What did reach the hill often consisted of half-destroyed C-ration boxes, soddy cigarettes, or medical kits scattered across the mud. Water came from rain caught in ammo cans or from canteens refilled with runoff, filtered through rags. No one complained. Complaining required energy, and energy was a luxury. Sleep was a fragmented thing. The men learned to rest in minutes, not hours, their bodies attuned to the rhythm of artillery. They slept fully clothed, boots still on, rifles within reach. Every sound carried weight. The snap of a twig, the faint crack of a rifle far below, or the whistle of an incoming shell. At times, the silence between attacks was more unnerving than the bombardment itself. It meant the enemy was moving. The psychological toll grew heavier with each passing day. Marines began to lose track of time. They stopped marking calendars or counting the weeks of the siege. To them, Hill 861 had become the entire war, an island of mud surrounded by unseen enemies. Private David Green wrote later that the only measure of time that mattered was the next airdrop or the next attack. Everything else blurred together into the same damp exhaustion. Yet amid the chaos, fragments of normalcy persisted. The Black Marines on the Hill, many from cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and New Orleans, would gather around a small stove built from an old fuel drum. They heated coffee grounds scavenged from supply crates and sang softly to keep their spirits up. Someone always hummed a few bars of Otis Redding or Sam Cooke, songs that drifted faintly through the night air, carried away by the wind. Those moments of sound were as close as they came to home. Sergeant Johnny Barnett maintained discipline without shouting. He was a quiet presence, moving from foxhole to foxhole, checking that every man had ammunition, dry socks, and at least some rest. He enforced rules that seemed trivial, shaving when possible, cleaning rifles daily, rotating watches. Not because they mattered tactically, but because they reminded the men that they were still Marines, not just survivors waiting to die. His authority came not from rank, but from steadiness. One night, a direct artillery hit struck a bunker holding 6 men from Gulf Company. The explosion buried them alive beneath sandbags and splintered timber. Without waiting for orders, Barnett and 2 others began digging through the debris with their hands, ignoring the incoming rounds still falling around them. It took more than an hour to pull the last survivor free. His leg was gone, and 2 others were dead. Barnett refused medical evacuation afterward, telling the corpsman, "I'll rest when it's quiet, and it's never quiet here." His actions never reached the division's daily report. To headquarters, Hill 861 was simply operational. The next morning, before dawn, Green and 2 other riflemen volunteered for a supply recovery run. During the night, several parachute drops had missed their mark, scattering ammunition crates down the slope, dangerously close to the jungle tree line where enemy snipers waited. Crawling through the fog, the three men inched toward the crates. The sound of distant gunfire cracked the air as bullets tore through leaves. Green dragged one box back alone, his hands bleeding from splinters. By the time they returned, one Marine was wounded. The platoon now had enough ammunition for another day. It was a victory measured not in ground gained, but in hours survived. Days passed without distinction. The rain never stopped. The men's uniforms clung to their skin like second layers of mud. Leeches infested the trenches. Rats chewed through ration boxes and sleeping bags. Some Marines developed trench foot so severe that their boots had to be cut away. The corpsman did what he could with dwindling supplies: iodine, gauze, and morphine. Nobody spoke of fear anymore. Fear was constant, like the rain or the artillery. It was part of breathing. Letters from home arrived sporadically, dropped in waterproof tubes along with supplies. Many arrived unreadable, soaked through and smeared with mud. Still, the men kept them, folding them carefully and tucking them into their helmet liners. Those few words from home were all that reminded them of another life, of families, of women, of streets without jungle. Some joked about what they would do when they got back: open a bar, buy a car, or never touch rice again. The laughter never lasted long, but it was enough to hold them together. Across the Corps, racial tensions were worsening. News from Da Nang and other bases told of brawls between black and white Marines, of graffiti and slurs painted on barracks walls. On Hill 861, none of that mattered. The color line dissolved under the pressure of survival. White Marines followed black NCOs without hesitation, and the respect that grew there was forged in mud and fire, not in training manuals. When rounds fell, nobody cared about race, only about who could shoot straight and who wouldn't run. By late February, Hill 861 was barely recognizable. The jungle around it had been burned away, leaving nothing but mud, twisted trees, and smoke. The hilltop sandbag walls sagged under constant shelling. The perimeter wire was mangled in places where explosions had torn it apart. The men knew reinforcements weren't coming any time soon, but they stayed alert, reinforcing what little was left of their defenses. At night, the Marines could see faint flashes of artillery from the main Khe Sanh base miles away. It was a distant world, one that had food, medical tents, and working radios. For those on Hill 861, the connection was spiritual at best. They fought for the same base, under the same flag, yet they existed on the outermost edge of the war, where recognition never reached. For the black Marines who held that line, there was a grim irony. They had been called unreliable by some officers before deployment, considered too undisciplined for frontline combat. Yet here they were, weeks into a siege that had broken men twice their rank. They weren't supposed to last, but they did. As February dragged on, Hill 861 no longer felt like part of the earth. It was a wound, open, bleeding, and alive only because its defenders refused to let it die. No reporter would write about them. No general would visit their ruins. But in the small circle of mud and fire they called home, every Marine knew what the others were made of. And that, for the moment, was enough to keep them fighting through another day on the edge of the world. March arrived, cloaked in fog and cold rain. The monsoon clouds hung so low over Hill 861 that the world beyond a few dozen yards disappeared entirely. The Marines could no longer see the valley below, or even the neighboring ridgelines. They existed in a gray bubble of noise and mud, surrounded by an enemy they could not see but always felt. Every day began with the same sounds: distant thunder that was not thunder, and the whistle of shells that came closer than the day before. For the men dug into the hill, life had become an unending cycle of shell fire, smoke, and silence between impacts. By then, the North Vietnamese had tightened their encirclement, moving artillery and mortars into positions that covered every approach to the outpost. Supply convoys were impossible, and even helicopters faced nearly suicidal odds. The Marines lived on half rations, then quarter rations. Meals consisted of damp C-ration crackers and thin coffee brewed from rainwater. Cigarettes, once plentiful, became a form of currency, traded for favors, for warmth, or simply for a brief distraction from the cold. The men had taken to burning wet sandbags to create smoke for heat, the bitter smell clinging to their uniforms and skin. The few helicopters that tried to reach them faced a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. Pilots often dropped supplies from altitude, unable to descend through the mist without being hit. Parachutes vanished into the fog, their payloads landing miles away or in the enemy's hands. Desperate for visibility, the Marines began marking their positions with panels made from ripped ponchos and uniform sleeves, arranged in crude L shapes on the mud. They hoped some passing aircraft would recognize the pattern and try again. Most days, the sky stayed empty. When supplies did make it through, it was chaos. On March 8, a crate of mortar rounds fell from a low-flying helicopter, splitting open on impact and scattering shells across the slope. The weapons section, 6 men, 3 of them African American, scrambled to recover what they could. Working in the drizzle, they cleaned the damaged fins with rags and reassembled the tubes with tools fashioned from rifle cleaning kits. By nightfall, they had 1 mortar operational. That same night, they used it to fire illumination rounds, bright white flares that hung over the valley like artificial moons. In their light, the Marines could see movement, dozens of NVA soldiers creeping through the brush. The attack that followed was one of the fiercest yet. The hill shook under waves of explosions, some so close that the ground seemed to pulse beneath the men's boots. Shrapnel tore through the air, slicing through sandbags and helmets. The illumination flares painted everything silver and white. Figures darting between craters, the flash of gunfire, the outlines of Marines hunched behind broken walls. The defenders fired until their barrels steamed, then switched to grenades when ammunition ran low. Sergeant Johnny Barnett, his hearing already damaged from earlier blasts, moved through the chaos directing fire. When a bunker on the western side collapsed, Barnett crawled through the debris to reach it, pulling 2 wounded men out under fire. He refused medical attention, waving off the corpsman who tried to lead him back. His words, shouted over the noise, became a kind of vow. "Nobody leaves this hill unless we all do." The phrase spread through the platoon, repeated like a promise, part defiance, part prayer. The night lasted forever. By dawn, the attackers had withdrawn, leaving behind scorched equipment and dozens of bodies tangled in the wire. Smoke rose from burning brush, and the fog carried the smell of gunpowder and blood. The Marines moved mechanically, repairing what they could, counting their remaining ammunition, and checking for wounded. No one spoke much. The silence after a fight was worse than the fight itself. The quiet was too empty, too final. As March dragged on, the weather worsened. Low clouds grounded all flights for nearly a week. No supplies came, no mail, no reinforcements. The isolation was complete. The Marines collected rainwater in helmets and canteens, boiling it over small fires that barely stayed lit in the wind. Some used pieces of plastic wrap from supply crates to catch condensation dripping from bunker roofs. Every man grew thinner, faces hollowed by hunger and exhaustion. Infection spread quickly. Cuts from shrapnel turned to abscesses, and feet left in wet boots for too long began to rot. The corpsman did what he could, but medical supplies were nearly gone. Morale depended on rhythm. The men followed the same routine every day: patrol the perimeter at dawn, reinforce bunkers, clean weapons, stand watch, and wait for the next attack. They rotated shifts, but no one truly rested. Some men kept journals in the margins of ration boxes, scribbling notes about the weather, the bombardments, and the faces of the men around them. Others stopped writing altogether. The siege consumed thought itself. Among the African American Marines, a sense of unity grew stronger. They had started the deployment as small clusters in mixed platoons, often marginalized or dismissed by higher command. Now they were the backbone of the defense, the ones manning the guns, hauling the wounded, and keeping the lines intact when others faltered. In the rare hours of calm, they gathered in a corner of the trench line, passing around what little coffee they had and sharing stories about home. They spoke softly, about music, about food, about women. For a few minutes, laughter returned to the hill. Then the next shell would fall, and the world would collapse again into noise. Private David Green, who had once joked about leaving the Corps after this tour, stopped making jokes altogether. In a letter written weeks later, he described the siege simply, "It's like living in the sky, surrounded by clouds and fire. We can't see the enemy, but he sees us. Every day we wake up and wait to see who's still breathing." The letter never reached home. It was found years later in his belongings, water-stained but legible. By late March, Hill 861 had earned a grim reputation among those few in the command who still tracked its condition. It was the northernmost anchor of the defense, small, battered, and clinging to life. To the Marines stationed there, it had become more than a hill. It was a state of being, suspended between survival and oblivion, between earth and sky. The fog never lifted, and even daylight looked gray. When the wind shifted, the men could hear faint artillery from Khe Sanh base miles away, a reminder that somewhere beyond the clouds, the war continued on other terms. But up here, in the clouds and mud, it was simpler. There were no politics, no slogans, no illusions of strategy. There was only the hill, the enemy, and the will to see another dawn. In that suspended world, courage was not loud. It was quiet and stubborn. The act of standing, digging, and enduring when everything else had fallen away. The siege had turned men into ghosts, but they remained at their posts, unrecognized, uncelebrated, unseen. Hill 861 still stood because they refused to let it fall. And in the gray mist of March, that refusal was all that separated the living from the dead. The relief operation, codenamed Pegasus, had been announced over the radio in late March. It was supposed to break the siege, reopen supply routes, and reinforce the scattered hill positions. But on 861, where the radios crackled only intermittently through static, relief was just a word, something distant and almost mythic. The men could hear artillery in the distance and the drone of aircraft far away, but nothing came for them. The main base at Khe Sanh still stood, and the command's focus was there. The hills, as always, were left to fend for themselves. By this point, fewer than 50 Marines remained on 861, half of them wounded. Some had lost fingers or ears to frostbite-like infections caused by the constant damp. Others carried shrapnel in their limbs, too dangerous to remove without medical aid. They no longer bothered cleaning their uniforms or helmets. Mud had become their armor. The corpsman, with his supplies long exhausted, improvised bandages from torn shirts and sterilized knives in burning rags soaked with alcohol from cleaning kits. The sound of coughing echoed through the bunkers, some from smoke, others from pneumonia or infected wounds. The few weapons still functional were treated like sacred relics. The platoon's last M60 machine gun had a cracked barrel and could no longer fire long bursts without jamming. Ammunition was rationed to single rounds per engagement. Some Marines began carrying captured AK-47s taken from dead NVA soldiers, using the few magazines they had scavenged during nighttime skirmishes. The mortar section had fired its last shells days earlier. Now, defense meant rifles, grenades, and raw determination. On April 5th, the inevitable happened. A concentrated NVA artillery barrage targeted the command bunker itself. The first shells landed short, shaking the earth and collapsing sections of the trench line. The third round hit directly, collapsing the roof and burying everyone inside in a wave of dirt and splintered timber. When the smoke cleared, the radio operator was dead, the field phone was silent, and the last functional radio was gone. The hill was now completely cut off. No reinforcements, no resupply, no contact with the outside world. They were on their own. The men dug the survivors out by hand. Sergeant Johnny Barnett, half-deaf and limping from a shrapnel wound sustained the week before, took command. There was no question of surrender. His voice, hoarse from smoke and shouting, carried through the bunkers. "We hold until they come. Nobody leaves this hill unless we all do." Those words became the last order of Hill 861. For the next 48 hours, the siege reached its brutal climax. The NVA, sensing weakness, launched repeated probing attacks under the cover of darkness and fog. Flares from the valley below cast flickering light over the battlefield, turning the fog orange and red. The Marines fired at shadows, at muzzle flashes, at anything that moved. At times, the fighting was so close that rifles became clubs. Barnett moved between positions, loading rifles for men too weak to do it themselves, dragging the wounded into makeshift cover. Private David Green, gaunt from hunger and exhaustion, worked the perimeter, hauling ammo boxes and tending to casualties. When a fellow Marine was hit near the wire, Green crawled under fire to reach him, cutting through the tangled metal with a bayonet to pull the man free. The wounded Marine later died, but Green's act was remembered by every witness still alive to tell it. None of it appeared in the after-action report. The defenders of Hill 861 ran out of grenades by the second night. They began improvising, lighting small charges from mortar shells, tossing them downhill by hand. It was desperate, chaotic warfare, fought in darkness, mud, and exhaustion. Some Marines swore they could hear the enemy speaking in low tones just beyond the wire. The sound of digging, perhaps, or the rustle of movement in the brush. No one dared sleep. At dawn on April 7, the fog began to lift. For the first time in days, the men saw sunlight breaking through the clouds, pale and unreal after so long in grayness. They also saw movement in the valley, helicopters. The long-promised relief had finally arrived. UH-1 Hueys and CH-46 Sea Knights appeared through the smoke, escorted by Cobra gunships firing rockets into the jungle slopes. The NVA pulled back, disappearing into the mist as the first landing craft touched down on the scarred ridge. What the rescuers found defied expectation. The trenches were filled with debris and burned equipment. The air stank of cordite and decay. The surviving Marines were barely able to stand, their faces drawn, their hands trembling from exhaustion. Some had not spoken in days. Others stared blankly at the helicopters as if unsure whether they were real. Barnett, still refusing evacuation until his men were aboard, helped lift the wounded onto stretchers. Green, his uniform in tatters, carried the last casualty down the slope before collapsing himself. The official report, written days later, summarized the ordeal in one sterile sentence. Platoon maintained steadfast defensive position under continuous fire. There was no mention of the weeks of isolation, the failed resupplies, the dead left unburied, or the leadership that kept the hill from falling. For the High Command, Hill 861 was simply one of many outposts that had endured with distinction. For the men who had lived it, it was 75 days that felt like 75 years. When the survivors were finally flown out, the first thing most noticed was the silence. The constant background of artillery, the noise that had defined their existence, was suddenly gone. Many later said the silence was unbearable. They had lived so long surrounded by the sound of death that quiet felt alien. The helicopters carried them back to the base at Khe Sanh, where medics examined them and asked routine questions about unit strength, ammunition, and casualties. Few answered. Most just stared into space, clutching their rifles as if afraid to let go.
In the larger history of the siege, Hill 861 barely appeared. The official narratives focused on the main base and the airlifts that had broken the encirclement. The names of the men who held the hill, Barnett, Green, and the rest, were buried in appendices and unit logs. Yet those who were there never forgot. In reunions years later, they spoke of that hill as if it were a living thing, something that had demanded everything they had and then asked for more.
For them, Hill 861 was not a victory or a defeat. It was survival, stripped of glory, stripped of meaning, but real. It was the embodiment of what war truly was for those on the edges. Not the sweeping maneuvers of generals, but a handful of exhausted men in a forgotten corner of Vietnam, clinging to life in the mud, waiting for a relief that almost never came. When the siege of Khe Sanh finally ended in the summer of 1968, the headlines told a story of endurance, victory, and withdrawal. Newspapers printed photographs of helicopters lifting off the red dust of the plateau and generals shaking hands before cameras. The world saw the end of a famous siege, not the men who had held the edges of it. The small platoons on the perimeter hills were already forgotten. Their bunkers were left to rot in the rain, their names omitted from briefings and speeches. The battle was over, and with it, so were they.
For the Marines of Hill 861, survival did not feel like triumph. Most were flown out within days of the relief, their faces hollow and their bodies skeletal from months of malnutrition and sleeplessness. The doctors at Da Nang described them as combat exhausted, a phrase that disguised the reality. Men who had lived so long under fire that silence now terrified them. Many refused to remove their helmets, even in the hospital tents. The noise of dropping metal trays or distant thunder made them dive for cover. The siege had ended, but it continued inside their minds. The Black Marines, who had formed nearly half of Hill 861's defenders, received no particular mention in the after-action summaries. Their role, like their faces, blurred into the general phrase, "All units performed admirably." There were no decorations beyond the standard campaign medals, no public acknowledgments of leadership or sacrifice. The racial unease that had haunted the Corps before Khe Sanh returned quickly afterward. When the surviving men were reassigned, they found the old barriers waiting: segregated quarters, hostile stares, and the same dismissive assumptions about discipline and reliability. On Hill 861, they had been equals under fire. Back in uniformed peace, that equality evaporated. Sergeant Johnny Barnett returned home to Illinois in late 1968. The Army gave him an honorable discharge and a train ticket to Chicago. He arrived carrying a duffel bag that still smelled of smoke. For months, he barely spoke about the war. His family said he spent long nights on the porch, staring into the dark. When people asked where he'd been stationed, he simply said Khe Sanh and left it there. No one in his neighborhood had heard of Hill 861. The newspapers had moved on to the Tet Offensive, to politics, to casualties and protests. His war existed only in memory. Private David Green, younger and less guarded, tried to explain what had happened to friends back in Mississippi. He described the noise, the rain, the smell of the earth after shell fire. But he found that most people didn't want to hear it. They had opinions about the war, about whether it was right or wrong, but no sense of what it meant to live for months under bombardment. Green soon stopped trying. When he was discharged, he took a job at a small machine shop. The owner never knew he had once fought on a hill that barely existed on a map. In official military records, Hill 861 appeared as a statistic: casualties, ammunition expenditure, enemy losses.
The reports listed positions, coordinates, and weather conditions, but rarely the human cost. Names like Barnett and Green appeared once or twice, buried in casualty tallies or unit rosters. Even in the Marine Corps' own histories, their story was reduced to an asterisk. The focus remained on the broader siege, the dramatic imagery of the base itself, the planes, the generals, and the symbolism of another Dien Bien Phu avoided. The men on the periphery never fit into that narrative.
It would take decades for their names to resurface. In the late 1980s, researchers working through the U.S. Marine Corps Operational Archives stumbled upon a box of handwritten notes from 1968. Inside were fragments of field reports, diary pages, and after-action summaries from junior officers. The handwriting was rough, the ink faded, but the details were unmistakable. References to Hill 861, to the long isolation, to men holding beyond reasonable endurance. Among the notes were mentions of a Sergeant Barnett, PVT Green, and mixed platoon composition, primarily Negro riflemen, strong cohesion under fire. These rediscovered documents challenged the sanitized version of Khe Sanh. They revealed what the official histories had omitted, that some of the hardest fighting had been done by troops who were rarely photographed or quoted. In interviews conducted years later, veterans confirmed what the papers suggested, that the Black Marines on 861 and the neighboring hills had carried a disproportionate share of the burden. They were the ones sent to repair broken positions, retrieve supplies under fire, and hold trenches long after others were rotated out. They had been invisible in the war's narrative because their presence complicated the story America wanted to tell about itself. Historians later described the rediscovery as a correction to memory. The battle for Khe Sanh had become a symbol of endurance, but only in broad strokes, whitewashed and simplified. The real endurance had occurred in the forgotten trenches, where soldiers who were mistrusted by their own commanders fought with a determination that defied stereotype. They had no expectation of medals or recognition. Their reward was survival, and for some, even that came at a cost too heavy to carry home. In reunion gatherings decades later, a few of the surviving men from Lima and Gulf companies met again. Their hair had turned gray, their bodies slower, but when they spoke of Hill 861, their voices hardened. They remembered the taste of dirt in their mouths, the rain that never stopped, the faces of friends lost to shell fire. They joked about the army rations, the leeches, the absurdity of it all. Then the laughter would fade, replaced by silence. Barnett was there once, sitting quietly at the end of the table, saying little. When someone asked him how it felt to finally have people talking about their hill, he answered, "Too late for most of us, but at least it's not forgotten now."
The memory of Hill 861 became part of a larger reckoning with the Vietnam War, not the politics, but the people who fought it. As documentaries and oral histories emerged in the 1990s, the story of the Black Marines at Khe Sanh finally found its place, though still on the margins. Their courage didn't fit into the heroism the country preferred. It was quiet, unadorned, born of necessity. They hadn't fought to make statements about equality or recognition. They fought because no one else was coming. Today, the site of Hill 861 is covered in grass and trees. Rusted shell fragments lie half buried in the soil, and the jungle has reclaimed the craters. There is no marker, no monument, no sign that men once bled and died there. But in the archives, in the faded handwriting of young Marines who refused to let their comrades vanish into silence, the record remains. Those notes, once nearly discarded, are the only monument they ever received. The siege of Khe Sanh entered history as a symbol of American endurance in Vietnam. Yet endurance has many forms. For the men of the forgotten platoon, Black Marines who fought from trenches no one would ever photograph, endurance meant surviving invisibility itself. They proved what history failed to acknowledge, that courage was not confined to race, rank, or recognition.
It lived in the mud, under the shell fire, in the hands of men who refused to let go of the hill, even when the world had already moved on.